Okay, tadi kita dah tengok macam mana oxygen and carbon dioxide is transported. Cuma in a more detail, kita nak tengok macam mana, how do we read the graph yang melibatkan oxygen, dissociation, oxygen and hemoglobin. Okay, kita boleh translate dalam graph dan kita nak tengoklah. This graph is called oxygen dissociation curve. Dan by the end of this lecture, you should be able to analyze and explain. Dan awak juga kena compare the oxygen dissociation curve for hemoglobin dan juga lagi satu pigment yang carry oxygen yang kita panggil myoglobin. Kalau namanya myo means melibatkan apa? Melibatkan muscles. Okay, this pigment memang present in skeletal muscles. And you should be able to compare lah. And you should be able to analyze the effect of the changes in the partial pressure of carbon dioxide towards the dissociation curve of oxygen, which is kita panggil Bohr effect. Tapi nanti kita akan tengok. Okay, kalau kita tengok the oxygen dissociation, kalau kita tengok the oxygen dissociation curve for hemoglobin, dia akan bagi this what we call S shape. Dia bagi this sigmoid shape. Okay, kenapa? Sebab nanti kita akan because actually kenapa dia sigmoid? Sebabkan due to the cooperative binding of the oxygen. Okay, sebab satu oxygen dia akan bind menyebabkan the rest of the apa ni? Dia akan increases the affinity of other subunit to accept oxygen, so dia akan meningkat dan meningkat. Akhirnya dia akan fully saturated lah. That's why dia punya graph tu bentuk sigmoid. Tetapi okay, kita nak tahu this oxygen dissociation curve, dia menunjukkan the relationship between the degree of hemoglobin saturation with oxygen at the different values of partial pressure of oxygen. Tambah sini, saya terlupa. Sekejap, saya tambahkan lah. Between the degree of hemoglobin saturation with oxygen at different values of partial pressure of oxygen. Dan tolong ingat, tolong faham ya bahawa dekat yang y-axis xy, dekat y-axis adalah oxygen saturation with hemoglobin at hemoglobin percentage dan bawah ni adalah partial pressure of oxygen mm Hg. Okay, I pun tak tahu apa benda tu, but mmHg je I tahu. Okay, dan dekat bawah ni dia adalah different at a different location. Kalau you tengok, if you look at it, okay, dekat lung memang kita akan tinggi with partial pressure of oxygen. That's why almost 100%. Okay, dekat tissue pula in respiring tissue during exercise memang sangat low in partial pressure of oxygen. But tissues at rest pun kita ada, cuma dia tidaklah terlalu kurang dia punya partial pressure of oxygen. Okay, cuma you boleh nampak dia ni more sikit daripada tissue during exercise. Sebab tissue at rest dia tak buat apa-apa. Dia tidak memerlukan oksigen banyak. Maksudnya oksigen tu masih ada agak banyak lah berbanding dengan tissue during rest. But itulah dia dekat around 40 mmHg. Okay. Yang penting y-axis adalah oxygen saturation, x-axis adalah partial pressure of oxygen. Okay. Kalau kita tengok, okay, when the partial pressure of oxygen is high in lung capillaries, apa yang kita boleh nampak, hemoglobin has high affinity for oxygen to form oxyhemoglobin. Okay, kalau kita tengok dekat sini, if you look at dekat lung memang akan ada high partial pressure of oxygen. Okay, that high partial pressure of oxygen means that oxygen akan bind dekat, oxygen will bind dekat hemoglobin. That's why if you trace dekat this graph, kita boleh nampak oxygen is memang, hemoglobin is memang saturated with oxygen. That's why dia punya percentage to almost 100, tapi tak akan sampai 100, around 98% saja. Okay. Dekat 98, at lung, 98% of hemoglobin is fully saturated with oxygen. Okay, itu cara dia. Kenapa? Because hemoglobin has a high affinity towards the oxygens in order to form oxyhemoglobin in lung capillaries. Okay, dekat lung. At lung, inilah dia punya explanation. HB are 90%, hemoglobin are 98% saturated with oxygen. Kenapa? Because of higher partial pressure of oxygen in lung, HB has higher affinity kepada oxygen. Means that oxygen akan bind dengan hemoglobin lagi banyak. Dan HB are saturated with oxygen, bind to for oxygen to form oxyhemoglobin. Okay, to form oxyhemoglobin. HB0, HB02. Okay. However, okay, when the partial pressure oxygen is low in respiring tissue, kita boleh nampak semakin partial pressure of oxygen is tu makin kurang, you boleh nampak dekat graf ni, semakin partial pressure of oxygen semakin kurang, hemoglobin semakin kurang saturated with oxygen. Apa maksudnya? Maksudnya oxygen tu release lah daripada hemoglobin. Semakin berkurang partial pressure of oxygen, okay, contohnya dekat tissues at rest and tissue during exercise, oxygen memang tidak saturated with hemoglobin memang tidak saturated with oxygen sebab oxygen is released dalam tissue. Okay, that's why hemoglobin dissociate and oxygen is liberated, mean oxygen is released. Okay, awak boleh tengok dekat sini dekat tissues during rest, masa tissue tak buat apa-apa. Contohnya masa awak berehat, okay, tissue awak tak buat apa-apa. Contohnya masa tu tak bergerak. Apa yang berlaku ialah partial pressure pada ketika itu dekat 40 mmHg. Okay, ketika itu juga in 40 mmHg of partial pressure of oxygen, okay, hanya 70% of hemoglobin akan saturated with oxygen. Lagi 30% of hemoglobin tidak, lagi 30% dia tidak saturated kerana 30% tu dia release, okay, dia release oxygen. Oxygen tu dia akan use in respiration. Okay. Lower partial pressure of oxygen, okay, reduces the affinity of hemoglobin to oxygen, menyebabkan oxygen to dissociate from hemoglobin, from oxyhemoglobin, dan percentage of hemoglobin saturation with oxygen, ni oxygen with oxygen akan reduce rapidly. Betul lah kalau awak tengok dekat sini, semakin berkurang partial pressure of oxygen, semakin berkurang hemoglobin yang bind dengan oxygen. Means that the oxygen is released dekat dalam tissue. Awak kena baca macam ni baca ke bawah. Semakin berkurang the partial pressure of oxygen, semakin kuranglah oxygen yang bind dengan hemoglobin. Kenapa? Because affinity towards oxygen is reduces, okay, in hemoglobin, causes oxygen to be released from the hemoglobin kepada tissues. Alright. Dan the last one, kalau awak tengok during respiring tissue, ketika exercise, ketika awak exercise means that memang awak punya tissue, memang awak punya masa memerlukan oksigen untuk carry out the cellular respiration to produce ATP. Apa yang berlaku ialah oksigen memang is sangat-sangat less saturated with hemoglobin. Kenapa? Because dekat dalam respiring tissue, the partial pressure of oxygen sangat-sangat rendah. So at low partial pressure of oxygen, okay, at low partial pressure of oxygen memang, okay, hemoglobin is not saturated with oxygen because oxygen to be released into the respiring tissue disebabkan due to the reduced affinity of hemoglobin towards oxygen. Okay, tissues are highly depleted with oxygen. Then the partial pressure of oxygen is very low dekat respiring tissue, means that Hb affinity, okay, Hb affinity, the binding of Hb kepada oxygen is very low, means that Hb can further release the additional oxygen, okay. Dan oksigen tu akan digunakanlah untuk the respiring tissue, dan eventually bila oksigen dalam hemoglobin tu dia bagi, bila you bagi something, you kurang lah kan, dekat diri you akan kurang. Sama juga macam hemoglobin, bila dia banyak bagi oksigen, dia punya oxygen saturation dekat dalam diri dia, the amount of oxygen yang dia ada akan berkurang. That's why oxygen saturation is low during tissue during exercise kerana the partial pressure of oxygen sangat rendah pada ketika ini. Okay. Dan kenapa dia akan menunjukkan sigmoid curve? Kenapa dia bentuk S like this? Why does it show the sigmoid curve? Because this is due to the cooperative binding of hemoglobin. Di mana satu bind of oxygen kepada satu subunit of hemoglobin cause the changes in the conformation of other subunit. Okay, dia akan increases the affinity of the oxygen to bind with the subunit lah. Okay, means that dia akan bind 1, 2, 3, 4. That's why dia akan bentuk macam ni lah. Dia akan bind 1, 2, 3, 4. Eventually, dia akan fully saturated dengan the hemoglobin. Okay. Dan as I said, at partial pressure of oxygen 0 mmHg, kita boleh nampak tissue memang during masa ni tengah exercise lah. Okay, ataupun actually basically awak mati pun actually partial pressure of oxygen is low lah. Means that memang tak ada oksigen akan bind dengan hemoglobin. Cuma kita tak cerita pasal mati lah. Kita cerita during exercise. Okay, during exercise, apa yang berlaku memang partial pressure of oxygen is very very low. Okay, kerana oksigen digunakan. dan no oxygen is attached kepada HB molecule. Kenapa? Because due to the ability of HB to release oxygen easily when the partial pressure of oxygen is low. Bila partial pressure of oxygen is very low, means that dalam diri dia tu dalam diri tu ada oksigen, tetapi dekat luar tu kurang oksigen. So lagi senanglah dia nak beri oksigen tu dekat luar, kerana dekat luar tu memang partial pressure of oxygen is very low. So bila senang dia lagi nak bagi, that's why dia kata HB is more easily to release oksigen daripada hemoglobin. Kenapa? Sebabkan ada cooperative release tu juga. Bila satu oksigen dia release daripada satu subunit, okay, kita ingat balik. Bila satu oksigen is released daripada satu subunit, menyebabkan the rest of the subunit akan change its conformation, menyebabkan the rest of the oxygen daripada di ada subunit akan lagi senang nak release the oxygen. Now, bila dah tak ada oxygen bind dekat hemoglobin, memang betul lah kan, hemoglobin is not saturated dengan oxygen. That's why dia punya percentage of saturation is very low. Okay, dekat sini. Clear eh? Dan at 40 mmHg, apa yang berlaku ketika rest, hanya 70% of hemoglobin present as oxyhemoglobin, means that hanya 70% of hemoglobin yang bind dengan oksigen. The rest tu memang lagi 30% tu dia release carbon dioxide, dia release oksigen kepada respiring tissue. Otherwise, walaupun tissue tu berehat, dia tetap melakukan cellular respiration. Kalau tak ada oksigen dekat tissue during rest, memang matilah tissue tu. Okay? Dan kenapa 70%? Because this is due to the high affinity of hemoglobin kepada oksigen. More oksigen akan bind dekat hemoglobin. Bila more oksigen akan bind dekat hemoglobin, satu oksigen bind dekat satu subunit, that akan causes the conformation of changes in the hemoglobin. Hence, lagi more oksigen akan bind dekat hemoglobin lah. That's why 70% akan bind dengan hemoglobin. Lagi 30% tadi dia akan digunakan. Okay, the rest of 30% is unloaded. Okay. The rest 30%, ini adalah 30% of oksigen tadi, dia akan diberi kepada tisu yang resting tadi. During the resting tissue untuk carry out dia punya normal metabolism lah. Okay, lagi 30% ni dia digunakan. Lagi 30%, lagi 70% ni dia simpan, dia akan bind dengan hemoglobin. 30% tadi dia akan digunakan untuk normal metabolism. Okay. At high partial pressure of oxygen, apa yang berlaku? Contohnya 98 mg dekat dalam lungs, HB is completely saturated with oxygen. Kenapa? Due to the high partial pressure of oxygen. Bila high partial pressure of oxygen, more oxygen akan bind dengan hemoglobin. And that's why lah dia adalah 98% of hemoglobin memang fully saturated with oxygen. Okay. Further uptake of oxygen can occur, but 100% is rarely achieved lah. Okay, hanya 98% sahaja. Itu adalah hemoglobin. Ada another pigment yang boleh bind dengan oksigen yang only present in skeletal muscle. This present in skeletal muscle yang kita panggil myoglobin. Kalau kata myo means melibatkan muscle. Okay? Kita akan tengok apakah perbezaan dan juga kepentingan myoglobin ini dalam skeletal muscle.